Hello everyone and welcome back to BlenderDiplom.com. I'm Gottfried Hofmann and this time we are going to recreate this cool particle effect. It's a reminiscence of the spirit of television that came to visit Berlin in late August this year, and Frederick phoned me and told me everything about the phenomena, and he also sent me a mesh of the Berlin Tower so I could try to recreate this cool natural phenomena with a particle system. So here it is. Let me give you a small overview before we are gonna rebuild all this. I got a small emitter that's traveling around the path. It's emitting particles, and the particles are dispersed in a really organic, nice looking fashion by a force field, and we are using a turbulence here. Then we got, of course, the particles itself. And let me show you what the main part of this tutorial is about, and it's about shading in cycles. I'm gonna show you a lot of new features in Blender 2.64, like the particle info node or the light fall off node. This is actually a very cool special effect we're gonna create later on this small sphere here. I'm not gonna go into too many details, but yeah, this is mainly about new features in Blender 2.64 inside cycles, for particles, and also in the compositor like this ellipse mask here. So, let's go. This here is the starter.blend, which you can also grab on blenderdiplom.com and use it for your version of this effect. I'm gonna start right ahead, and I'm gonna create a path. So, mesh path. And that's because I want later on to have a sphere following this path, and the sphere should emit particles, and all this should go somewhere somewhat around this TV tower model we got here. So let me also try to grab all of these and get them up and down a little, so we got a nice downward spiral that's going up again here and then towards the camera. And I'm not gonna waste too much time with this, because the cool stuff is gonna be the particles and not so much how they travel around this TV tower thing here. So maybe put this here. And then let's extrude this here, and let's see now how this is going. Oh, it's going a little not so cool. It should stop right next to the camera. So put this here and put this here, and then let's see where this is going. Maybe downwards. So, and then when it's going out here, then there will be a lot of particles flying around directly in front of the camera, which will look pretty cool actually. And maybe put that one a little up here too. So yeah, that should be about it. Particles coming from here, slowly then going up there. So yeah, that's it. Next thing I want to do is I want to add, of course, the emitter. So I'm setting the 3D cursor exactly to the starting point of the path. And then I'm going to object mode, add a sphere. Let's use an icosphere. Make it smaller, shift select the path, control P, follow path. And now if we scrub through the timeline, we see the sphere following the path. But it's kind of fast and it's stopping at frame 100. We can fix this by going to object data, and here in path animation there's label frames, and we can set it to about anything we want. I'm using 200 frames for this animation. So yeah, that's it. And now let's add a particle system to the sphere. So I'm just gonna add a particle system, and now I'm already starting to choose the correct settings, also not settings, but I'm trying to name everything. So we are not getting distorted by weird names. So this is yeah, path.particles, and parented to it is the emitter we're gonna use. So let me just add a very simple particle system. I'll start with 50,000. We'll later on need to up this number quite a bit, but 50,000 is a good start. And yeah, lifetime I'm gonna set to 100 because I want this to end the entire animation on frame 300, and I want to be particles there up to the very last frame. And I'm also giving this a random. This will just say some particles die sooner, and this makes it just a little bit more realistic. Then emit from, well, let me choose volume, and put the cache step size to 1, set it to disk cache, and light compression. We're gonna need this later on when we bake this, so we can scrub through the timeline, and choosing disk cache with a light compression will just mean that we need less RAM because it's grabbing the particle files off the disk. So here is velocity. What's this doing? Let me see. This is how they're currently emitted, and they're going pretty, they are shooting out from the sphere, and I want this to be far less strong. So see the difference? And I'm also down here under field weights want to turn off gravity, so the particles will just stay around the place where they are emitted. And now, yeah, that's about it. Let me add a force field because I want them to be distorted in an organic manner. And I'm gonna add a force field turbulence. It just doesn't matter where you add it because it will work on the entire scene. So let me call this turbulence. And now enable physics for force field, turbulence, everything is alright, but I want it to be stronger. Set the strength to 5. And now when you look at this, we see how they are already getting distorted, but the distortion is kind of big. And that can be set by the size. By default, it's 1. And that means that the structures we are creating is 1 blender unit wide, and that's so wide, and that's of course a little big. So I'm setting it to 0.5, and now let's see if this is looking cooler. Yeah, it's already looking a lot finer, but we got another problem here that the particles are going faster and faster, and they're kind of dispersed. There's a lot of dispersion going on, and I don't want this. I want them to be fluid, and a fluid organic-like motion. And I can change this by setting the flow to 1, which will mean that the particles are not dispersed into all directions and getting forces here and there, but they are flowing along the field we created it. So this field has is 3-dimensional, and by setting to flow to 1, the particles will flow along the forces of the field, the force strings. And this is looking a lot better now. It's now looking very organic, very nice, and that's exactly what I want. So far for the particles and for the force field, what we're gonna do now is we're gonna create a particle that's getting a cool material, because right now, if you set the shading to rendered, you'll not see anything because Cycles is not able to render the default particle type, the halos, yet. It might be in the future, but for now we need to create an object that's gonna be duplicated by the particle system. The particle I want to be on a different layer because it's gonna emit light, and I don't want it to shine the light on anything in the scene from this particle, just from the particles that are gonna be emitted. So let me set the shading to smooth, and now let's turn on all the other layers back on. Now I can select here the particle system that's emitted from this sphere, and down here in render I can select object, and let me first see the particle is here. Let me call this particle.icosphere. And now, when I go back to the particle settings here in Object, I can just select it, particle.icosphere, and you already see in the 3D viewport a lot of duplications of the small sphere. Let's make this a lot smaller. We'll probably need to tweak it later on, but 0.005 should be a good start. And also, let's add quite a lot of randomness, which will only make the particles smaller, not bigger. So, now this is already a pretty good start, and let's go to the shading here. Let me turn on rendered mode, and you'll see that that each and every particle object now has a default diffuse material, which might be cool if you want some dust or sandstorm around this tower. But I want it to shine somewhat magically, so let me remove this diffuse material and add an emission shader instead. So, now this is of course looking pretty cool already. Let me also change the color to something more bluish greenish. Yeah, maybe this here. And up the strength a little bit. We'll need this later on when we got fine structures here and a lot of particles are in front of each other, so they can sort of add up and become a little lighter than it is allowed, so we can add cool effects in compositing and make this look really, really cool. And now I got a problem here, and that is that all particles have the same strength in emission, and when they die, they are just popping away, they are just removed, and I want them to slowly fade out. And that's something we can do now in cycles, thanks to the new particle info node, which was introduced in 2.64. And let's see what this has as options. We got here age and lifetime, and it's already sounding pretty cool. They got grayed out outputs, which means that they are outputting a number. And we can use this number, for example, to drive a mix shader. So let me shader mix. Let me add one. And let's mix this with a transparent material and see what this mix shader is doing. If we set the factor input to 0, we see it's completely emission material. They all have emission. And if we set the factor to 1, we see that they are all transparent. So what we need is a value between 0 and 1 that's corresponding to the lifetime. What do we have here? Or to the age of the particles. We got age here, but if we set this here, there's something weird happening. That's happening usually when the number inside the shader is way bigger than 1. And actually, the age of the particles will be the age it has in frames, which means in our case it can be up to 200. And down here the lifetime is how long can a particle live, and that's in our case, as we set it here in the particle system, 200 lifetime can be 100 frames. So, how can we solve this riddle? Well, it's pretty simple. Let's just choose converter math and divide the age by the lifetime. Let's first see if this is working, and yep, it's working perfectly. Particles are fading out, or if we switch this, they are actually fading in, as you can see here. And now is the question, how is this working? Well, if you got a particle that is just born and has an age of 1 frame, and if we divide that by 100, the maximum lifetime, then we get 0.01. And that's a value that's very close to 0, so it in the factor input will mean that it will be nearly purely emission and nearly no transparency. Now, if we got a particle that's near death, it's got an age of 99 with a lifetime of 100. If we divide 99 by 100, we get a value close to 1, 0.99. So if we go into the mix shader, it will be the bottom one, and that will be transparent. So this is how you can create a cool and simple particle fade out in cycles. Now let me take care of the emitter here, because I want this to be also pretty cool. I wanted to shine additional light onto the TV tower. So what can we do here? Of course, we can also give it a material, and of course now once again not the diffuse but an emission shader. Where do we have it? Emission. So let me also make this somewhat bluish, but a little more blue than the other one, and set the strength to, yeah, 50 maybe. 50? 50. So now it's shining light onto the, you can see it at the rim here, that it's shining its light onto the tower. And I'm also changing the color more to a more greenish one. So that's also pretty cool, but we got this bulb of light here, which I don't really want. I'd like this to be invisible. So if we do the same, here we can turn off ray visibility if we want to, but this will remove the entire sphere. So let's do something else here. Let's once again mix it with a transparent shader, and shader mix, and now something pretty cool we have here is an input light path. Where is it? Light path here. There we got a note that says is camera ray, and now if I put this here, see, it's gone, and we only got the particles that are emitted at the front, and it's still shining its light onto the tower. Pretty cool, right? And now for further effects I want this to have. I'd like it to have more of a volumetric kind of effect, and effect where the particles are reflecting the light from the emitter at the beginning, and later on this should become more of the emission that's mixed with the transparency. How can we achieve this? Well, what we can do here is once again mix the emission with something else, and that will be a glossy material. So let me move this emission here, let me duplicate the mix shader and put the emission down here in this case, and to the top let me put a shader glossy. So here too, and let's put the factor to 0.5 at first. And now we see we got the light reflected that's coming from the sphere at the beginning, but it's not, we don't see the sphere, we only see the particles that reflect the light, and they're reflecting a little bit down here, and we got here a more volumetric approach because we got now real geometry and not just pure emission material, and that will look really cool when we add more particles later on. And now let me also add this, so we can have the same effect that it's becoming more and more emission material the older the particles get, and then everything is all once again mixed with transparent. And let me also put the roughness down so we can see the effect a little better, and it's because now we got a stronger glitter down here, and the effect is starting to look pretty cool. So now something else I'd like to do with the particles now, and that is that they are going through the TV tower. And I want to both fix this and also use the way that we fix this to add another cool effect. So to avoid this problem of particles just flying through solid geometry, we can simply select the geometry, and in the physics panel right at the right we can turn on collision, and when we bake the simulation the next time, the particles just shouldn't go through. Let me turn it on for this structure too. But here in the middle we have quite a lot of geometry, and it's also different parts. And if we would turn on collision for all these parts, the computations would take ages, because collision is usually hard to compute. But we can solve this problem by using a so-called proxy object. Let me put the cursor to select it here and simply add a sphere. So add mesh UV sphere and make things smaller. So it's just a little bigger than our structure here. And now, if we turn on collision for this sphere too, particles will just bounce off the proxy object, and it will look like they are bouncing off the structure. So let me also give this a good name. And now there are a few other things I'd like to do with this object, because I also want the effect that the particles, when they are very near to the center of the tower, that they are more bright. And I can achieve this effect by making them reflect light that's cast from this proxy object. So this is something pretty cool. Let me just go back here into rendered view and turn off ray visibility for the camera. And now we see that the light just can't get through there, so let me also turn off ray visibility for the shadow. And we also see that the light that is cast from these windows here, it's deflected and going back to the structure, so let's also turn off the ray visibility for diffuse. So problem solved, and the parts at the top, they are transmission material, so let's also turn this off. And let's just keep the ray visibility for glossy, because our spheres have a glossy material. Now let's give it a material. So, new. I actually think I can speed things up if I remove this view here. So, I'd like this to be a shader emission. And let's put the strength up to 100. And also change the color here to something more bluish. While our sphere had a greenish color, and let's make this here kind of bluish. And now we have a problem that it's also shining light directly onto our structure here in the middle, and I don't want this. And the way we can fix this is by giving the inside another shader than the outside. And we can do this by using a mix shader once again. And once again with a transparent shader. And let me add input light path. No, input geometry. And there we got a pretty cool output that's back-facing. And if I put this in here, this will mean that the inside of the mesh will have a transparent material and the outside will have an emission material. Pretty cool, right? Now let me go to the beginning to see if everything is working fine, and we see it's not working fine. And you can see here up here, there where we got transmission materials, that there still is some light is cast onto the transmission material, and down here where we got diffuse material, so some light is still cast down here. There, it's coming from this object, even though we have turned off diffuse and transmission. And that's a problem in cycles with meshes that have an emission shader. And we can turn this off pretty simple by down here under settings, sample as lamp. We got this turned off and the problem is solved. And when we go back to a place where there are a lot of particles, we see that the particles get light from this. So the glossy material is still getting light from this, while the other materials don't do this anymore. So to prove it, let me turn this to red. So to another color, and yeah, everything is working as expected. So this is all for the settings for the shadings of the particles and everything. But before I'm going into the compositing, let me bake the particles again now with collision, and also I'd like to add a star field behind the tower. And in Blender, so in Blender internal, there was a setting right in the world where we had stars. That's gone now in Cycled, so we have to build the star field ourselves. And once again, we're gonna do this with, you got it, particles. Creating a star field in Cycles is actually a pretty simple task. Let's just add a cube and place it slightly behind the tower. And let's also set the display to wire so we can see through it. And now let's just move it right here, and I'm also gonna move it upwards a little, and now I'm gonna scale it on all axes except the y-axis, and now also a little bit on the x-axis, and yeah, this is where our star field is gonna be generated. Star field. Okay, so let's go to particles, add a particle system, and set the start and end frame for the emission to 1. So they get all emitted at the first frame, and the lifetime to 300, so they stay there. Set the emission to volume, and a few other things we need to change. We don't want them to move away, so let's turn off velocity. And under under field rates, let's of course turn off gravity too. And now let's see whether they are staying there. No, they don't. And the problem is that our force field, the turbulence field, is on the very same layer as you can see it here. So star field on the same layer. What can we do? Let's simply move it to another layer, layer 5. And now if you go to frame 1 and start the animation, stars will stay still. The number is maybe a little high with the 1000. Let me reduce this to 500. And if you are on frame 1, we can easily change the distribution of the stars by changing the seed. So this will just give us a random distribution every time, and let's change it until it looks cool. Yeah, this is quite okay. Now let me add onto the garbage layer another icosphere, and this one will be the one for the stars. It's just gonna get a simple emission material with a purely white color for the stars, and the strength a little stronger than 1, maybe 2, so that it's just shining a little brighter than the maximum brightness for in an image, and that would be an emission of 1. So let's call this star. No, particle.star. Particle.star. And let's turn on all the other layers again. And go select the emitter for all the stars and go back to the particle system where we under render. Once again, use object, select particle.star. Of course, it's way too big once again. Let's maybe 0.3. No, we need a 0 before that. And now let's check out how this is looking. And we only see the emitter. Let's turn this off. And now we see the stars. And they are quite small, everything is cool, but I will turn on the randomness. So we also got very, very small stars that we can barely see. And the biggest a star can be is this size, which is very small. So this is looking pretty cool already. Something else I want to do is I'd like to have the stars on a different render layer than everything else. And we can simply fix this by adding another render layer. And the top one should have all the layers enabled, 1, 2, 3, 4, where we got all the stuff and the particles, and the bottom one should just have the layer number 5. So now if we got going to Compositor, we can now select the particles, the stars in a different layers and the everything else, and we can do some really cool compositing with it. And also something I wanted to change about the render layers for the stars is the number of samples, because they are just an emission material. They just don't need as many samples as the render layer. We got all the particles and the tower. The samples option is also new in 2.64, and it will determine how many samples the render engine cycles is gonna use on that layer. So if we change this to 20, it's gonna be ultra fast the stars, and the normal render layer we got 0 here, and that will be exactly the number we are setting here on the sampling when we're gonna render. And another small thing I'd like to change before we go into compositing, you see I've already did this, is the depth of field of the camera. Because right now, when the particles at the end are very near to the camera, they'll look like this, just ordinary small spheres, and this will look kind of ugly, while it's looking cool when they are further away. So what I'd like to do is I'd like them to be blurred when they are very near to the camera, and we can do this by setting the depth of field for the camera. Let me first set the focus point. It should be our proxy object. So proxy.collision, so the focus point for the camera is now exactly the TV tower, the middle of the TV tower. And then we can change the aperture, so things are getting blurred when they are very near to the camera. So this is looking a lot cooler now than before, where we see the difference? Before, ugly blobs. Afterwards, they are nicely blurred, and this will look really, really cool. And since we changed the aperture just very little, the TV tower is still perfectly in focus, just as the stars behind here, for example. So pretty cool thing. And let's just check it whether it's also working fine with the particles. Here at this per frame, the particles are all really near to the TV tower, and yeah, it's working fine. They are not blurred by the camera. They are only blurred by the camera if they are very near to it. So really cool right now, and now so we can go to compositing. But first, let me rebake the particles animation with lots and lots of particles and then render it. So this is just taking too much time if you look at live. So here I am in the compositor. I've used a lot more particles, rendered everything, and I've also made the particles slightly smaller. So let's see, we got the render layer for the tower and all the particles, and let me add another render layer where we got the stars. So here we got only the stars now, and what I'd like to do is I'd like to make this a really nice sky. I've also turned on transparent for the render, so we got transparency behind, and I'd like this to be a sky, like a night sky, where we got some bluish tint down there, and it's becoming darker and darker up there. So how can I achieve this? Well, I can create some kind of color ramp, or maybe even better, kind of ellipse. And for this, Blender 2.64 has a really cool new addition. Let's see, under Matte, Ellipse Mask. And that node is basically creating an ellipse, which we can, for example, blur to create a cool gradient. The problem with this is we can't really see it right now. We can only see when we click it, the area in which the ellipse is going to be created. So let me make this a little bigger, like a width of 1. And if the width is 1, then it will be exactly render size. The height is relative to the width, so it's of course now bigger because the render size isn't square, it's 16:9. But that's not much of a problem here. Let's just keep it here and make the width a little bigger. And now let's also move this up a little bit. So we got here, down here, there should be the ellipse we have. Now I'd like to see it, but I can't see it yet, and that's because, it's invisible by default to the viewer node. But we can make it visible if we mix it with a render layer. So let's mix it with as alpha over with the stars we got here. And now we can see it. And there is some stars on top of it, but we can see now our mask. So what can we do to make this look a little better? Of course, we can blur it. So let's blur it, set it to fast Gaussian and to relative, which just means that the blurring will happen relative to the size of our screen or our render. And let's set the Y blurring pretty big, and now we got a really nice gradient, but it's still white and black. But we can change this by using converter color ramp, and now we can simply change those colors. So let's say it starts with a very dark blue and turns into a pitch black that's still bluish, but it should be even way more darker. So now we got our night sky, and the factor is maybe not really correct right now. Or do we see any stars here? Yep, I see we need to switch this, and now we got stars. Perfect. And one thing I'd still like to change before I'm adding the rest of the stuff is that I'd like the stars to become less bright when they are more down to the more down where things are brighter. That's something you can also really see in photographs of the night sky, or when you look at the night sky, when the atmosphere is becoming brighter, then the stars, you can't see the stars anymore. And we can simply do this by multiplying the blur node over the star layer. So let's go to mix. Let's not mix this, but rather multiply. And now stars are becoming less bright down there. So perfect. First part is finished. Now for the second part, I'll just duplicate this alpha over node and alpha over the particles over our night background. And what I'd like to add now is a simple glow around the particles, and that once again is really simple. Let's just blur them. Filter, blur. Now set it to fast Gaussian again. Once again relative, but I'm just choosing 1% and 1% here. And now let's add them back to the original image with a mix node that's set to add. And let's put the original one back there. And yeah, they got a nice glow around them now. But the problem is that also the tower is also glowing, and we can easily fix this by doing a little color correction on the input image for the blur node. So let's go color RGB curves. And when we are reducing the contrast and the overall, not the contrast, but the overall brightness of the input, then the blur node will only blur the bright parts, and when we add it back together, then the bright parts have a nice glow, while our tower is safe and doesn't glow anymore. So that's the first part of the glow I'd like to add, and the second part is I'd also like to add some glare for the very bright parts. That is done by filter glare. And now let's see what's happening when we choose the original image. We see some streaks around our around our bulb. And let me just set the quality to low so that they are a little bigger, and I'd like to use 6 streaks so it's more star-like. And I'm also gonna increase the threshold a little bit so only the very bright parts get the streaks. And I'm also reducing the fade quite a bit so it's fading out a lot faster. So let me check this here. Here we got probably some nice streaks. Let me set the mix to 1. And then we can see where we got all those streaks. And yeah, this is already looking pretty good. Let me just reduce the fade a little bit to roughly 0.75 or 0.78. And now we can also add this on top of the other stuff. And we got a nice glare here, nice streaks, and we got nice blur effect around the parts that are very bright of the particles, and everything else is looking fine. Yeah, that's perfect so far. One last thing I'd like to add to the composite is I'm usually doing at the very end of each cycles render I'm due, and that is lens distortion. And just very subtle, we got down here this dispersion thing, and when we turn it on, you see that around the edges things are getting dispersed into the base colors of the RGB spectrum. That's in effect you see in lenses normally, but here it is way too strong. If we set it to a very subtle amount, then you see that things are getting just a little smoother towards the edges and also a little less grainy. You can also see it down here when I hit M. It's the grains are very sharp, and when I hit M again, they are softening up, and we got a nice little effect up there too. So the compositing is now also finished. And one last thing one might or might not do is change the color space of the output. Because this is a new thing in the scene settings, we got now color management, and when we, for example, choose film, it will look pretty cool because it will look now it will look like it was printed on film instead of created digital on a computer, which if you like it is actually looking pretty cool. But don't forget, if you change this, you might also need to change the other settings you got here, like for example make the sky down here brighter again. So we got the same effect now, but it's like it's printed on film. Pretty cool new addition, this color management, and I'm really gonna dig into this a lot more. One last thing I'd like to do. First of all, I'd like to connect the output of our composite towards the composite node, because otherwise the composite wouldn't be rendered. And something else I'd like to show you is maybe you don't like the fact that the blob here is so bright, and maybe you want it to be less bright. Well, the reason why it is so bright is of course the particles that are very near to the emitter are getting overbright because the emitter is so strong. The light that is emitted from the emitter is so strong. But in cycles 2.64 we got an option to cope with this problem, and that can be found under color light fall off. And if we set this to the emission and turn on the smoothing value down here, now have a look what's happening with the particles that are very near to the emitter. Yeah, they are getting far less light, while the light is still shining towards the rim of the tower and towards the other particles here. That's a very, very cool new effect, but I wouldn't set it too strong, like maybe like 0.1 is already enough. And that's also not just very useful here, because now it just won't shine so bright anymore after the compositing when we render this. It's also very useful if you maybe got a lamp and it's directly at the ceiling of your scene, and it's shining also towards the ceiling, and you're getting lots and lots of fireflies. around that area and also in your entire scene, because very strong light is bouncing off and that's just not so cool. And by simply using a light fall off with your mesh emitter and setting to a very, very subtle smoothing value like 0.1 will also already greatly improve such scenes. And thanks to this node, we can also have very good control of how bright our spot here is and how bright it will end up in the render. So really cool new addition. I can say I really love the new release 2.64 of Blender, and I hope you'll love it too. There are so many other new additions I couldn't cover in this tutorial. And something else, I'd really like to see what you guys are doing with the stuff I have shown you. So if you have created anything cool, head over to Blender Diplom, leave a comment with your example. I'm really eager to see what you're doing, and also if you maybe got an idea how to improve things, I'd also happy to know if you got any better ideas how to create this effect or how you can improve this effect. And also, if maybe you don't like something about this tutorial, maybe about the presentation, maybe I didn't tell you enough theory, or maybe I did tell you too much theory, maybe it's not in-depth enough or something, just head over to Blender Diplom, leave a comment. I'm always trying to improve my tutorials, and I cannot improve without criticism. So have fun and happy blending.